been dreaming about for decades. Julia Grosso from Vancouver to win it for Canada! Canada came! Canada conquered! Canada gold at Tokyo 2020!
You're listening to the Northern Football Podcast, your home for everything Canadian soccer, with Brendan Dunlop, Alex Gange-Ruzic, and here's your host, Ben Steiner.
Hey there, folks, and welcome back into the Northern Football Podcast. Ben Steiner alongside Alex Gange-Ruzic and Brendan Dunlop, episode 194 of NFP here. Ben and Alex in studio. Brendan, of course, remote today in Ottawa, so home of Rapid Ottawa. I don't know if you've got any new NSL merch to go with your Vancouver Rise merch, but Brendan, of course, joining us from the capital of our
First of all, buddy, I love that you speak NSL en français first, and it's Rapid Ottawa FC to you, and not Ottawa Rapid to everybody else. But no, I don't have any merch yet, man. I don't think I don't know if that merch has been out yet. I know everyone's asking for NSL merch, but no, I don't have any yet. I do intend to take my son to an Atletico Ottawa game on the weekend, in addition to a CFL game on the Saturday. So I had that intention when I was in Vancouver, and I was robbed because of they're trying to grow the game or whatever. So hopefully nothing gets moved at the last minute this time. But I'm intending to do a double football weekend with the little man because he's ball obsessed right now.
two teams in okay form, too. I don't know if we want to talk too much CFL here, but Alex, how you doing?
Doing well. No CFL talk for me today, but yeah, maybe when the playoffs come around.
Yeah, I guess Grey Cup is here. I mean,
Well, that's
maybe
it.
you'll check it out.
Yeah, maybe. Yeah, go Lions, right? Local team. Go local team.
And it feels a little bit weird for, Brendan to be remote because, of course, Alex and Brendan were in studio here, and now I'm in studio. So it just feels like a little bit of a different setup, and I'm still getting used to this. Alex, you've spent a lot of time in this setup, so it's kind of second nature to you at this point. But it definitely feels a little bit odd to me. And Brendan, I know you got some new gear as well in Ottawa.
Yeah, this is my travel gear, bud. Yeah, thanks for pointing it out. If I don't sound as good as before, and I don't hear you guys as well, it sounds like you guys are on a AM radio, but not that that's a bad thing. But I'll make do like Craig Force with my little remote hand mic here.
It says the AM radio guy.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah,
sounds great all the time.
I say he's used to it.
it's HD AM radio. That's what I like to listen to in the vehicle, though. Not what's in my old AirPods right now.
Say Brendan, Ben's smart. He didn't take your middle seat, probably because he knows if any wild Jonathan David takes come out, I can't just reach and grab him. I'm gonna have to get up. So he's smart. He left a little buffer.
You guys are old roommates.
Jesse Marsch was in the studio.
Oh, that's it. So
Jesse Marsch was in the studio, and I think he was sitting in this seat. So maybe that means I'm the smartest one on the podcast now, not you, Alex.
Yeah, go for it. I'd love to sit in Jesse's seat. So hey.
Also very presumptuous
Probably gonna start
that on Sakaris and Price that Jesse Marsch is the smartest guy in that studio. Very presumptuous by you. Very biased.
Yeah,
maybe best footballing mind. Although Blake's call on the goal with Stuart Armstrong and Ryan Gaulden, what was it, 7-pass build-up that the Whitecaps had, 1-touch passing. That was a good call. I like his Whitecaps calls. But and I guess we can jump right into the pod as well. Thanks again for joining us here on Northern Football. And it was a bit of a weird week because there wasn't a ton of news in terms of Canadian soccer, but this morning we did find out that the Canadian women's national team will have more games in 2024, and they will play October 25th, I believe it is, against Spain. And that's certainly, a good test, getting the World Cup champions. Spain, of course, they've had all the issues in their federation, Canada coming out of the drone scandal. So it will be an interesting matchup. And we might get some coaching news. At least that's what Canada Soccer said in their release, that there will be a coaching update on the women's national team as well. But, a fantastic test for Canada, right, Brendan?
Yeah, I think it's a great test. I mean, think about where Spain have come, since Canada won gold in Tokyo. Right now, they are the world champions. That program in La Liga have arguably made the biggest jump in women's football. So it's amazing that Canada Soccer were able to book that ticket. When you consider the controversy going on with the drone scandal and maybe the perception amongst other federations, to go and book out arguably the best team in women's football right now, not even arguably, definitively, that's a really, really good ticket, and some great work by Canada Soccer to be able to set that up, and a good test for the national team, though we don't really know what they're going to look like on the touchline. I very much assume that the coaching update is that there's some legal update on Bev Priestman, not that they have a new coach in mind, not that there's a new hire. I think it's more of a clarity of Bev will no longer be with the program, or we don't have an update on coaching. It could be that as well.
Yeah, I would imagine it's probably a mix of assistant coaches, if not, just running back what they did at the Olympics, because it's in just over a month, and I don't think you're going to get a coach for that game in just over a month.
No, there's no rush. They just released the schedule. The qualifiers are down the road. Sounds like Canada is going to get a bye straight to the CONCACAF championships for World Cup qualifying and Olympic qualifying. So they'd love to double up on that. So no rush. Allows you to kind of, let things play out. It's probably, like you mentioned, just a bit of clarity. But it's good they're going to be playing games in the meantime. Who said they weren't going to play games? I forget which one of you two it was, so I can't actually direct it. I know there's earlier in the summer when we had a bit of a wasn't a bet. So
it might have been me.
I think
it was me.
It might have been both of you even. Cause we
Sounds
said
like a Brendan take.
How many games will Canada get before the end of the year? And I said they will play before the end of the year. I just want to throw that in there. And hey, Spain's not a bad test, and hopefully whoever ends up being the manager uses it wisely. This is, I think, especially for some of these young players, like you got to be looking at. We'll talk about it in a bit. Some of the U20 women's players who had a good showing down in Colombia. Some of the younger players. Let them get a look against Spain, because tests like this, as we know, won't come around very often over the next few years because Europe's schedule is so ridiculous. So take this opportunity and run with it.
And maybe some women's players that landed in the Sports Center top 10 this week down in the States. Just an absolutely exceptional goal from Jade Rose with Harvard, although I think it was probably a cross. I assume that most of the listeners have seen that.
Did they have another angle, or is it just the one main shot? Did they have a second camera angle to that? Because I think it's unfair that there's not more justice to how difficult that is.
To me, it was the double nutmeg.
The nutmeg stole the show. The goal itself was irrelevant. It could have been a cross on the teammate's head and a goal. That it went in for her own goal is great. But, the nutmeg from a center back by trade, that's definitely what kind of flew under the radar. Everyone's looking at the goal.
100%.
Forget the goal.
Okay.
Gas up her skills.
That's what makes us great. It's all, we see the same play and we all see it differently, man. You're probably, the first thing you looked at was the expected goals for Clemson or whoever the hell she scored against.
0.0
before you could get super excited.
That's probably what that shot will rate in. The thing is, I could probably actually find what the XG
I was going to say it's NCAA women's soccer, but they actually probably have that. It's not the level of U Sports soccer that I'm so familiar with. But we'll jump into your questions on the CanMNT from Nick Spirit. Lots of talk about Lopez getting invited to camp during the friendlies, but that didn't happen. After watching that horrible Mexico display against Canada, I assume Lopez would be even more interested in joining the Canadian squad. Any chance he's invited to the upcoming Panama match? I would hope he is. But again, I'm just not sure about how much trial and error Jesse Marsch wants to do with these rosters, especially since he wasn't given the call, and it seemed like everything was kind of poised to get him that call in the last window. So I would imagine there's a call that goes out, but I'm not sure he joins for a single match and what might be a training match. Of course, there's been the rumors that there might be sort of a match against a club team or something like that.
So just before we touch on Lopez, I did find the XG on the Rose shot, 0.02.
Of course you did.
Shout out Y-Scout. So actually higher than I thought it was at 0.02. I thought 0.01. But for Lopez, I think it was something where I just don't think the last window lined up from what it sounds like. Just, obviously there's interest. We actually had the chance on One Soccer to speak to Santiago Lopez. That interview should be dropping any time now. So if you want to hear from Lopez about, what he thinks about Canada and playing for Canada and all that, we did have the chance to speak to him, and what he said is it just sounds like there's been preliminary, discussions, and sounds like it's just all right, head down, do your thing, break through at Pumas, and they're keeping an eye. And we'll see if October makes sense in that regard. But I think for now, I don't think there's a certain rush because it doesn't sound like Mexico at the moment has been too hot on the heels either. And I think potentially if they open the door, like Nick mentions, and they get in, if they start calling Lopez, I think that's where the pressure comes in to bring him into a camp, to start thinking about cap tying him. But I think Marsch is kind of, trying to play it safe, where it's something that Lopez, and again, he's said it many times, and now that we've spoken to him, he likes Canada. He's enjoyed his time with Canada. He's very proud to be Canadian. So he is something where the door is absolutely open from his perspective. And from Marsch, there's other dual nationals out there who maybe haven't, aren't as expressive or aren't, their door isn't as open, so to speak, that Marsch might be making a bit more of a priority. So I think that's also important to remember that, Mexico isn't as much in the mix at the moment, and that also Lopez is pretty keen on playing for Canada.
Yeah, Canada is definitely the more appealing choice for him, right? And I think he would lean that way. The fact that he came into camp and had a very good experience with the U20s, even though the team didn't have the success that they were hoping for, I think that definitely bodes well. I mean, it doesn't take much to sell playing for Jesse Marsch and the teammates in which he could call his teammates, even if he just shows up and trains with. So the opportunity to play in this next window, I think, comes down to whose spot would he be taking. And is it someone who's staying in Europe to recover from an injury? Is it someone who's not making the trip? Is it someone who can't afford to fit it into a busy fixture list that they're not going to make the trip? That's when I think you take those guys, because you're treating Lopez as a domestic, right? You're treating him as a short-haul flight, even though, albeit it could still be a 5-hour flight. He's not crossing the ocean. So that's how I think they'll look at it and judge accordingly, whether it's the right time or not. But I do definitely think he'll be in a camp sooner rather than later, and I do think he'll be cap-tied sooner rather than later. So they won't have the opportunity to do that officially in this window, so there's no urgency.
Yeah, for me, I think with Lopez, it's not something that comes in this window. I think it is something that could come in November if you're looking to cap tie him and you're looking at those Nations League games, or maybe it's down the road in a potential January camp, which I know we got a question on what a January camp might look like, and Jesse Marsch has spoken about a potential January camp as well, and I think he's a player that could benefit from something like a Camp Poutine and the return of Camp Poutine, which we haven't seen in 5 years now. But
because I think there's one in 2021.
It's been a little while since
there's 2021.
Yeah, it's been a while. Maybe not 5 years, but
I just always got to check you on your post-COVID numbers.
Time just is a time warp after COVID. But I'm just not sure that he's a call-up for this window, because you're not cap tying him. Are you throwing him into a game where you only have one game against a national team and then some sort of experimental game against something in the community? I just don't see necessarily the worth of calling him up when you still want to use at least that Panama game as something to continue to build the squad for 2026. And could he be in that squad? Yes, but I don't necessarily think the project is to have him starting in that squad.
It's funny that you phrase it that way, because I also think that whether your answer comes from this feeling that if a guy's ready to be called up, well, he just needs to start and be ready to go play in the World Cup, which has been the case with some stellar Canadians. And I mean, Tejan Buchanan was pretty quick like that, right? But Tejan Buchanan had a full MLS experience with at least a full season or a season and a half with New England. He was touted. He had the full camp experience. I think he had maybe before that Olympic camp that he played while Canada was at the Gold Cup. I think he'd already had some experience in the Canada camp if he'd not actually had his debut. To me, that's all valuable experience for a player to think that they're just going to come in once they're ready to be used in the starting lineup. Look, there's a few guys that works for, but I don't think that that's the norm. And I don't think that Marsch looks at building a team that way. I think you're talking about guys being involved and being a part of the program. Remember, he's thinking about 26, and I think it'd be very valuable if you're not taking a spot away from someone else that's going to be a part of 26. It's very valuable to have those people around. We see how important that is, just to have guys who aren't even playing but are the real team guys or a part of the squad, both on the men's and the women's side. Like Desiree Scott being at the Olympics, I firmly believe they do not prevail and get through and are not as strong mentally if you don't have someone like Desiree Scott in that room. Now, not alone, but I mean, you don't think that took a lot of pressure off Janine Becky, having Desiree Scott there, or Kaylin Sheridan, or the other veteran voices. So that all just goes to show that it's not always how it will benefit on the pitch for that specific game. I think that there's a lot of immeasurable value that comes with being involved in a camp, and I think that he would jump at that chance to get a call if it meant he wasn't being capped, but he was just involved in the environment and involved in the experience. I think that's something that in the game we are very quick to overlook because there's just not enough time, or it's all results driven and you're thinking about one specific target and task. But it shouldn't be lost on how much human value there is, I think, to that experience for someone who you're hoping is a key part of the program for years to come.
Well, with DeFougerol getting called in and Swiderski getting called in as a training player, Marsch has also shown that he's willing to look at guys. So I think for Lopez, it's again maybe a bit of both, where it's like Swiderski, it made sense, the season was over, everything worked out. Like Lopez is trying to win a spot right now for Puma, so I think it's also circumstantial. But I think if as soon as an opportunity comes, no hesitation. If he's the 30th guy, if he's not even going to see the field, but he's just there, I think there is.
That's my old man wisdom for you guys. I realize how much of a NFP dad I sounded like there.
Northern Football Dad, it's your brand.
It's a good brand, you know.
I sent that tweet.
I'm not going to fight
Gotta
it.
get you some onesies.
I'm not going to fight it. I will say that maybe I responded to that though by trying to look younger. After seeing that tweet of yours, I did shave, so I've gone back to clean shaven or at least short stubble in an attempt to look younger. So maybe that's combating the feeling that I don't want to truly be 1,000% dad yet character.
Well, I mean, the shaving as well. You've been more regularly on TV now than you have in the last couple of years, so it's reverting back to those TV habits of being clean shaven. Maybe you're back into your usual.
I can tell you this: I'm far less miserable than I used to be in the TV days, and there's a lot to say about that. So,
I think we need the beard that you had when you were doing stuff with One Soccer, though. During the pandemic and the island
my
games.
Wild that was Elliot Friedman level pandemic cottager beard. That's never coming back because divorce would come along with that. So that beard, I can guarantee you, is never coming back.
And we'll jump into the question from Vince Alvarado. Are there any youngsters on the cusp of first team club breakthrough, or just a general prospect that you've had your eyes on that, in your opinion, could be a surprise for the senior men's team heading into 2025 or even 2026?
Always a fun question. I mean, there's always a couple we're keeping an eye on. What I would say is we're about to talk about a couple in the next question, so I'll try not to have too much overlap, but in, no particular order. There's a couple in Europe that have really, stood out. One that's kind of came out of nowhere a bit lately. I think he's a former TFC guy. He's also playing in the Croatian top flight as a center back. It's Jovan Ivanisevic. Center back, 19 years old. He's been getting regular 90s. I think right away you're thinking, all right, that center back depth could always still use a bit of a jolt. So you're kind of keeping an eye on that. Some other ones as well include like an Ethan Schilt-Brown who played at the U20s, and he's in Kilmarnock, where I think there's a bit more of a natural route for him to break right into the first team versus some of the other obstacles that you might face in a club setup. So those were definitely two that came to mind. Another one that I've been keeping an eye on, we'll see if he debuts soon, but he keeps getting included on Heracles' benches, but it's Thiago Codinha, another U20. He's like a number 10, which is, a bit of a prospect position of need for Canada. So that's kind of something where if he can break through and get those minutes for Heracles, I know another Canadian eligible, Luka Kalenovic, made his debut this past weekend for Heracles, so maybe they'll follow suit and give another debut to another Canadian in Codinha. Those are a couple of the ones out in Europe, and of course in the CPL, MLS, there's always a lot to keep an eye on, and I'll try to get a few more of them out in our next question.
That's why we have you on the podcast. That's why you've stuck around. We're brought on the podcast with Peter and Thomas, and have stuck around, and are the, I guess, leader of this show, because both Brendan and I aren't watching 17-year-olds in Croatia or wherever.
Hey, you never know. It's good just to keep an eye out. So when they do have their moment, do get the call. It is nice to have seen a bit of a body of work, and you're not kind of blindly guessing at what you might be seeing with some of these players. I actually haven't had a chance to see all of them. Codinha I got to see at the U20s. I think it was 2-3 years ago he played. But I'll have to keep an eye on this Ivanisevic guy. He's playing in the middle of a back three for a top-flight Croatian team. Like, that's someone who I genuinely am going to be keeping a closer eye on and try to see if I can catch one of his games in the next few weeks.
And I guess you're always rooting for somebody with the last name Itch, considering Ruzic.
Hey, you can never have too many, Eastern European guys out there. Certainly for in terms of football, those guys are always warriors. So usually that bodes pretty well, and just in terms of like that grinta. So never a bad.
Not too many guys named Dunlop in professional sports. I've always wanted there to be like a real Dunlop. There's a Dunlap in the NFL. And that's like as close as I'm gonna get.
For me, the only notable, I guess, Ben Steiner that I can find is the guy that played in the 30s for the Red Sox. And he's a handsome guy. He's got a great old baseball card. I wish I could get my hands on that, but you should have seen me in softball last week. The Fall Jays in the North Toronto Co-ed Softball League. We won 34-15 or something like that.
Oh, wow. Who are you playing, the Jays?
No defense whatsoever. No defense whatsoever. Wow. I ran into my teammate at second base because she didn't move to third, even though I was told by our guy standing at first that I should go to second.
Blame the girl on your co-ed team, Ben. Base. Blame the girl on your co-ed team. That's a real smart move in 2024. Yep.
The men were not fantastic either, but there was only one person that I collided with, and that was my teammate who I'm blanking on the name of.
Don't out Amy. Don't out Amy for her athletic failures, okay?
We won. That's all that matters, right? In co-ed
I'm
softball.
happy for you, Ben. I'm happy you won your North York
yeah.
co-ed softball league. That's awesome.
Oh, it was fantastic. Nearly took a softball to the head as well. That wouldn't have gone well, but completely misjudged a fly ball in the outfield, and it was coming right for my head instead of my glove. But I managed to get out of the way of it, dropped the ball. Was not the best play, but I think that's as much as we have to talk about my co-ed softball.
And any CanMNT prospects?
Well, I mean, it's only sort of 1 degree away from the CanMNT because John Lobin, the communications director for the men's national team, chirped me about missing the softball game a couple weeks ago because we had our Alistair Johnston interview. So I guess we're not that far away from the
your whole
CanMNT.
6 degrees of separation. You take some liberties to that to draw things together, but I'll take that. Nice John Lobin shout out.
1 degree of separation. John's been great with the men's national team, but we'll jump into this next question that I love. Brendan, I know you're less than enthusiastic about it, but from Nicholas Friend, really enjoying the pod, guys. My question is, if Marsch ran a winter camp and wanted a red, black, and white type games to see as many players as possible, who would make the teams, red being CPL, black being US-based, white being rest of world? And I took some liberties with this because I called the Canadian MLS teams US-based, but I also only made starting 11s, and I think Alex did as well. But definitely an interesting question because I'm not sure, who you're necessarily calling up. Are we calling up the big guns in this? Are we calling up, the top European players for this Canadian squad, or are we calling up like prospects? And Alex, I know you took a bit of a different route than I did, but Brendan, I guess being the moderator on this.
Yeah, I didn't do this fucking question, guys. Yeah, sorry, Justin. I definitely.
You mentioned that. It took a bit of time, to be fair. Shout out to Canucks Abroad, as always. And we've got the Canucks Abroad roundup coming up after. But would you have taken the liberties and called up the top players, or should this be sort of like in the weeds players, like some of the names that Alex just listed off?
I mean, in the terms of trying to salvage good radio, I would not go deeper in the weeds than that. No, that Alex named. I think I knew 50% of the names Alex dropped, and that's why it's great having Alex on the show. But if you hit me with another 75% to 50% of guys I don't know, that might be too much. If that's too much for me, I just feel like it might be too much for everybody else listening.
I'll say you underestimate the NFP listeners.
You're right. I shouldn't.
They are very deep in the weeds, and I say that in a good way because it's a fun place out in the weeds sometimes. You'll end up on Twitter and you'll see some random folks just tweeting about, second Dutch division games, or you'll be tweeting about the Croatian top flight or tweeting about whatever. And that's why we like the NFP listeners. Like, it's an educated bunch, and so that's why if they're willing, again, that's why shout out Nicholas. We appreciate the kind words with the message, and that's why if you want to drop in the weeds questions, I'm ready to go as in the weeds as needed to answer them.
I'm just picturing I am the scarecrow, like you guys are like in the cornfield, and I'm the one like just obliviously standing out on the yelling and moaning and complaining and screaming. That's
so. What am I, a mole?
No, not a mole. You'd be in the maze. No, you'd be in the corn maze.
What's another like a vole or something, like one of those burrowing whatever.
Shoeless Joe Jackson was in the corn weeds, man. There's a lot of shout out to James Earl Jones. There's a lot of goodness in the weeds. I didn't mean it in a bad way.
I'm saying we're from Vancouver. We're very aware of different kind of grass.
I mean, if we're talking about 1930s Red Sox, Ben Steiner, it was right there.
Two Ben Steiner references in one show. Let's see how it's going to be.
Okay, I'll jump into my CPL team first. I put together an 11. It was almost more of an all-star team because I don't think CPL players are necessarily turning down this opportunity. So my strikers are Brian Wright and Tristan Borges. My midfield is Sean Young, Dan Nimick. I've moved up into midfield with Manny Aparicio. Sean Rea also in midfield. And then my back line, Demi Antonoglu, Noah Abatne, Amir Didic, Matteo Debrienne, and Callum Irving in net. So that's my CPL team. Alex, what about you?
I'm just going to say it's an arrestable offense, like straight up to be listing your team from striker backwards. That's a horrific, like that is very.
Do you usually do that, Ben? Like, how did that even happen?
No, that's just how I wrote it down. I wrote it vertically, and so I have striker at the top of the dock, that shouldn't have been.
I'm with Alex on that. Great call out. Deserve it.
That's rough, but wow, I'm gonna try to recover. I went for a bit of a younger, and just kind of like, of course, a bit more in the weeds. I went Gazdov in goal, of course, having a great season, young prospect. Liked what I've seen. Back four, I went James Cameron, Noah Batney, Dan Nimick, and Malik Owolabi Bellew. It's very tough between Owolabi Bellew and Temi Antonoglu, but I just wanted to put Owolabi Bellew. Bit of an under the radar season for Forge. I like what he brings there. I went for Hojabapour and Safwan Mullah as my double pivot. I really liked Mullah since he signed for Valor. That's been a bit of a good one. I went 4-2-3-1, so I went Alaj Ba on the right. I went Maël Henry. I went Massimo Ferrin, but bit of something different. Guess I could always plug in Antonoglu there if I want something different. And I went Lowell Wright leading the line. But that's one thing I did notice. There were not many young Canadian strikers this year. Poku was pretty much the lone productive one. And, hey, he did so well, he got sold. But Lowell Wright moved back to the league. Still young, still U21. He's working with Tommy Wilton Jr. I think there could be some good fits there. And just some fun names. I always have a few extras. I know people always like to hear the honorable mentions. I had Eric Kobza at the back. I had Max Ferrari. I just wanted to go James Cameron because I feel like he's just a Jesse Marsch player, the way he runs, the way he operates. I got Wes Timoteo as another left back option, Sean Young, Baloo Tabla, and of course Antonoglu, as I mentioned. So that's my CPL team.
Brennan, who do you think has the better team out of that?
To be honest, head to head, I think I give the edge to Ben's team. I think that you took a lot of picks from the heart. You had Hojabapour though, Alex. Yeah, I think that you have a better midfield pivot, and I think Hojabapour is ridiculously underrated. It's almost criminally underrated. If he played on any other team, he's playing every single minute of a CPL season, right? Like without a doubt. And I mean that's part of the appeal to why guys go to Forge in the first place is because they're so strong because they are so deep and they can balance, and that's a different experience in its own right. But yeah, I think Hojabapour is pretty good, but overall I give the edge to Ben, but that's because I'm the old guy and I think I have to lean that way. If it's all about the young guys, then I'll be out of a job real quick.
So to be fair, having Aparicio, Brian Wright, all that whole group is pretty good attack.
Yeah, it's a solid attack. I wanted to sort of get Dan Nimick in there somehow, but I also wanted Noah Batney. So it was a little bit tough moving Dan Nimick into midfield, but I feel like
Nimick's a good shout. Yeah. You know what won me over, Alex? Because he went strikers first. That's what did it. He went with the big name, sexy plays first. That's what did it.
So do you want to read your MLS team from back to front?
Yes, we will go from back to front or bottom to top on my list here. I've got Jonathan Sirois in net, then backline of Sam Adekubi, Kamal Miller, Joel Waterman, and Richie Larea. And then defensive midfield of Jonathan Osorio and Nathan Saliba. Then midfielders on the wide with Ali Ahmed, Isaiah Johnston, and Jacob Schaffelberg. And then my striker being Wubens Pacias.
I like the Pacias shot. He's on fire right now.
I mean, he's probably going to get a contract with Nashville next year. I'm actually surprised he didn't get a contract for the rest of this season, considering the roster freeze.
He should, but Nashville has, 2 international spots because they trade him away so much. So a bit unfortunate for Pacias because A, Nashville sucks right now, and B, he's been on fire. So I love the shout. We decided I was going to put some first team guys in, then we decided I would put some younger guys just for a different team so we don't copy each other, because I think Ben's team is very good and understandably so, and it shows the amount of depth the CanMNT has of guys just playing in MLS. I went Sirois in goal. I think that was probably the consensus. I went Kobe Franklin at right back. I went Bilal Halbouni. I think he's still out. We've been having this discussion on One Soccer, but we'll have to actually get some confirmation of this sooner rather than later. I realize I forgot a center back, but that's okay. I can get one right off the top of my mind. I'll go Sal Metzefero, plugging away at Austin 2 there. That's one I'm surprised he didn't get the call up to this year with how Austin's defense has been. If I want another one, I also got Keishan Ferdinand over at Portland if we want to do the Canadian connection. I got Jaquil Marshall-Rudy at left back. Bit out of a position, but I went for 4-2-2-2 this time. Double pivot of Jeevan Badwal, Nathan Saliba. I went for 2 10s of Brandon Cambridge over at Charlotte FC. I think he's an interesting dual national, and he's, if not for an injury, I think he'd be really getting good minutes right now. And he's been getting minutes as he returns from that injury for Charlotte's first team. Stephen Afrifa is paired with them as the double 10s. And I went Jules Anthony Ville-Saints, Arash Madani's favorite. And then I went for Jason Russell-Rowe. He's kind of a bit, not so much a prospect, but we really haven't seen much of him with the national team. So that's kind of what I went for. I also have Kamani Stewart-Baines as a bit of an honorable mention for the future. And yeah, that was kind of my MLS group.
And how about your team rest of world? I didn't quite finish mine off.
I'll say, Brendan, any thoughts on that?
I think Afrifa's the first guy that with appearances, I think, that was mentioned, right? Or did Ben have one that I missed? So I like.
I had a few. I had the Azorios.
Oh, sorry, of course, yeah. I just got two.
No, Jason Russell Rowe.
But you mentioned Russell Rowe after Afrifa first. It was to go back to my point about this being interesting radio, is that Ben's lineup was so long ago that I forgot that he had Osorio and Larrea and the regular guys. But Afrifa was the first one on your team that I heard. They're both pretty good teams, man. I like your variety. You obviously don't agree with Vanni Sartini, who thinks that the backup in Vancouver is better than Sirois and deserves to get the national team shouts, because you guys both went with Sirois, which I found interesting. But Sirois is pretty good. Other than that, no, those are two pretty good teams, man.
What is this Thomas Hassel LAFC backup erasure?
Or Isaac Boehmer, to be fair. He's been having a good season as a CAN champ in Leagues Cup. And he's going to start the final next week. It's been confirmed as long as he stays healthy. So, maybe he'll have a big performance against the Italians, and everyone will start to want him to get
I hesitated because I was going to call him Thomas Boehmer. I knew that was wrong because it sounds like that would be Ben's lawyer. So I'm glad you filled it in there.
Boehmer and Hassel.
Boehmer and Hassel. What a law firm. Oh my God, that's a real game, guys. Let's pick players most likely to sound like a law firm. That you might have just won the game. That might be it.
I mean, Akindele will probably have like a urban planning firm at some point.
Doing a pretty damn good job of it, to his credit.
Oh, I totally nerd out over his Twitter timeline a lot of the time. But we'll jump on from this great radio segment.
You don't want my European team anymore?
Oh yeah, your European team. I was gonna jump right into.
Alex, you go first so that I can remember the names that Ben says. Go ahead, you go first.
I know Ben didn't get around to finishing, so you only got mine to focus on. So lock in. Lot of wild names. No, I think in goal I was kind of debating between Gregoire Swiderski and Owen Goodman, but I'm gonna go Owen Goodman just because he's playing professionally in League 2.
No Tom McGill, huh?
They're all at the same level, and Goodman's like a good couple years younger than McGill, playing for Wimbledon. So shout out to that. I went for a back four. This one's just completely makeshift, but I went for Jamie Knight-Labelle, Luc de Fougerolles. I went for Ivanisevic, and then I went for Schilt Brown. So a couple names I shouted out earlier. Midfield pivot of Seeger and Laturi. So some podcast favorites there. And then we got Santiago Lopez and Jaden Nelson as your double 10s. And then I got Kwasi Poku and Promise David leading the line. So honestly, I think there's some pretty fun names there that hopefully we can see a couple of them in the national team.
Jaden Nelson's a good shout. There was an event that they did in Toronto. I wonder if this was when it was announced that 2026 was going to be in Canada, or would that be too long ago? Would Jacob Schaffelberg have been around then? That would have been too early, right? That was 2018. I can't remember what the event was, but they were in a bar. Some TFC players were in a bar, and Jaden Nelson was still on the team. Schaffelberg was still on the team because they were both being interviewed by Matthew Shinetti. And he said, you guys are two guys very likely to be in the Canada squad come 2026. And they both nodded with such confidence. And I thought, yeah, man, they're both going to be. And Jaden Nelson might be a superstar by then. I forget what the timeline was for this interview that I'm talking about, but I still think, he's got potential. 2026 coming up super quick. Do you know what I'm talking about?
I think I remember. Was this not when they announced officially the venues? Like it was when they did like Vancouver was confirmed, Toronto was confirmed, and they did that like show. And I think that was maybe why they were doing some interviews like in Toronto. So I think this was maybe like 2021, 22 maybe.
Picked like the few Canadian youngsters on TFC that actually got minutes at that time.
Yeah, it could have been something like that, or they picked like the bidding cities or something like that. It could have been it, because I think when they actually did the big show with Becky G and Victor Montagliani, I don't think
And
those
Drake.
guys. Yeah, Drake was there too. I don't think those guys were around at that time. But either way, it's Jade Nelson is someone that's interesting, because I think in Norway in general, you are very out of sight, out of mind. That is a league that's a little more in the weeds than others. And Jade Nelson's someone who people I think have forgotten about. So yeah, good shout on him. Now we can try and pay attention to him in Germany.
So much so that he's playing in the second division.
Exactly. Yeah.
I was gonna say he's just completely escaped everyone's radar in Norway.
Okay, so I've put together a Team Rest of World.
So let me guess, Davies.
I've put together the
David,
best team possible.
Laren.
Yeah, we've got the back line of Davies, Bombito, Cornelius, Johnston. We've got Chouanier and Estacio, I'm going with. Then we got Tejan and Nico Sigur. Jane Nelson, I'll throw in as well. And then Kyle Aaron and Jonathan David. So basically the Canadian starting 11.
So you don't like Ismail Kone?
Blanked out on him while making this roster while you were talking, to be honest.
Wow.
So yeah, we're gonna drop Matthew Chouanier for Ismail Kone, and that would be my roster. And basically the Canadian starting 11, which is impressive considering it's pretty much all Europe or rest of the world at this point.
Yeah, imagine saying that a few years ago, that you could have two competent teams of just MLS first teamers and just European first teamers.
Yeah, so mine's certainly a little bit less entertaining because it's pretty much just the first choice 11. But we'll jump into the U20 Women's World Cup as well. Canada's journey at the U20 World Cup came to an end in the round of 16 as they lost to Spain 2-1. Despite that, a fair amount to be optimistic about, but I do think there's still a lot of problems with the youth levels to be ironed out to get better results at these tournaments, because Canada hasn't had the best record at these tournaments, even though they did get farther this time in the expanded tournament. But still, it was a draw against France in a game that they looked like they could have won. It was a loss against Brazil in a game that they didn't really look like they were necessarily in. And then, of course, the big win also in the group stage against Fiji. But it's about kind of figuring out the rest of this tournament and getting those wins that they're in games and they can't finish them off. Like in the Spain game, they allow a goal, it's tied, and then they can't find that second, like they can't hold a lead. Like it was just, there's not this confidence in the Canadian youth teams, I find, and we saw it at the U20s for the men's national team, that there's confidence, but they can't necessarily get the result. With the women's national team, it seemed like they weren't necessarily confident when they had good positions, and it just seems like there just needs to be a bit more direction with these youth national teams.
Ben, before Tokyo 2020 and 2021, did you ever see a Canadian team that looked confident?
I would say that the Canadian women's senior team had looked confident for a while before Tokyo.
Capable.
Definitely 2012.
Capable.
Yeah.
I wouldn't say confident. I would say they look confident against the States in that semifinal game. I won't take that away from them. And they definitely looked more than capable in the bronze medal game, which they won. And there was maybe flashes of that, but the thing that you're describing that you want to see in the youth team comes from experience, and it comes from exposure. And far too often we've treated the youth tournaments, the youth programs, as an afterthought. Or as just a functional obligation, as opposed to something that requires care and planning and strategy and funding. And I know that sounds like I'm just like beating the old drum, but that's exactly why you don't see any of those things. And that's why these teams don't perform well. And, the women's team was speaking about that and very vocal about that over the last 2 years in their public fight with Canada Soccer, because they absolutely know that that's what other teams are doing correctly and why other countries have closed the gap so quickly. And so for Canada, I think it's the confidence that you're looking for comes from doing other things correctly and preparing these teams for those tournaments. And we're still a little ways away from that. I think there's certainly more of a understanding of how important that is now, and there will be more of a focus, and there will be revenue generated exclusively for that. It will be prioritized in ways that it wasn't before. But just interesting to see that's the observation that you thought really stood out, because I mean I would hope to see that, but that's something I kind of an expectation I didn't put on these teams, and maybe that's because I'm looking through things with a little more cynical lens than you. But I certainly didn't expect to see that from either the men's U20 or the women's U20 team in this tournament.
I think when you look at sort of the situations that these players are playing in, and the structured environments that they're in, whether that's with NSDCs, with colleges, with professional academies, at least on the men's side, you should have a little bit more of that confidence because there is a more structured environment than there was in those previous generations. So that's part of where the confidence comes from. But I also think there needs to be a bit of a different route in terms of streamlining just how everything works across the board in the youth national teams. And I think it would actually benefit Canada Soccer to a point, like an overall sporting director type thing, to oversee everything from, the work with the head coach of the women's national team, whoever that might be, with Jesse Marsch, and then also streamline everything below that. So, you're developing teams from those, U17 levels all the way up to the first team in a way that we've seen sort of Spain do it over the years, where, you're graduating coaches from those lower levels up into the higher levels. For the women's national team potential coaching vacancy, we're talking about a potential of a Cindy Tai, which I don't think anybody's necessarily talking about her moving up to that role. And so I think there just needs to be more of a streamlined pathway, both in terms of coaching, both in terms of playing, in terms of development across the board, that we haven't seen in this country. And if that gets put in place, it's a massive project to put in place, no doubt. But we see it with the likes of a Spain, with the likes of an England, with the countries that have, developed those coaches, developed those players throughout the levels. And I think that's something that could benefit Canada. And that's not a role that Canada's necessarily had filled, sort of an oversight sporting director role. And I think it could be interesting organization.
I think that's a great shout. And a sporting director specifically, and the idea that you're going to have some pathway or some type of step program within the coaching system, as opposed to looking at it separately, which is how we've always looked at it. The U15s are U15s, U17s, U17. And there'd be personnel or some coaches that would try to implement some type of integration, but it was exclusively based off of personal relationships. It wasn't based off of any structure. Mm-hmm. It was almost like nepotism. If there was a senior coach that paid attention to this team because there was some personal connection there or some relationship, right? So yeah, I completely agree. You want to get away from that and have an actual function system. And when it comes to employing Canadians and having Canadians work in the game, people who know the program, know the system, have experiences elsewhere that can bring that. Like, that's what's so valuable about Kevin Blue and Jesse Marsch. They both have tremendous experiences elsewhere, in addition to whatever their relevant sporting experience is to be, qualified for the positions in which they have with Canada Soccer, right? I really like that shout for a sporting director. And, the tag that they put on this Mauro Estacchio position, this like coaching internship or whatever, I really think that's the intention behind it is great, but I don't like that it seems like a revolving internship door. I think that there should be a way to make that feel more deserved and justified and part of like the stepping stone program. And I think if you had a sporting director who I would really hope would exclusively be either an ex-pro or an ex-coach who has some experience within the national program, even if that's only as a player, in order to bridge those gaps and bring all those things together.
I mean, for me, in terms of what the ideal person for a sporting director would be, it would be someone from one of those countries that has had that pathway established, and you bring them over and they can kind of build that pathway in Canada. And I think that's something that could work. Of course, there's the financial side of it, which of course, might be a little bit more sorted out now that there's a tentative agreement based on whether CSB is able to rework that deal. But I think bringing someone over who has that experience of, bringing players and coaches up from the U15s all the way to the first team and creating that identity, like when you look at Spain, I think they're this kind of standard example, even though they've had a whole bunch of issues within their federation. But you look at Spain, like their U15s play the same way as their first team does on both the men's and women's sides, right? Like there's an identity to that federation. Yeah. And the way that Spain plays. And I think, Jesse Marsch has spoken about it already, that there's some people who say that you can't necessarily have an identity with the national team, but then, what the hell are you coaching for, right? You need to have an identity in the way that you're playing. And Marsch has been able to do that with the men's national team already. and it's about passing that down throughout the system. John Herdman, I think, was like the director of philosophy or something like that in terms of, also managing some of the youth teams and how they worked, but it was never quite the sort of synergy in the system or pathway that I'm kind of envisioning for the long term of Canada Soccer that is sporting.
It's interesting, though. I'm going to pull on this point, and I'll direct it to Alex, that you say you want to see someone come from another country that's established this, because I think the massive difference is in any of those countries you're talking about, and specifically Spain, is they have an entire infrastructure that starts from U4. Like that, we don't have that. Like the players haven't gone through a pathway system like that. The pay to play makes it so fucking complicated, and you lose so many people, and or you end up putting players in situations where their talent wouldn't naturally put them in, whether that's good or bad, right? So I don't think you can do that at all. I think what's good is if you have someone who has an experience that isn't exclusively to the domestic hell and chaos that I'm speaking about, but immediately actually someone who comes to mind for me, especially when you have people like Blue, who has a sporting experience and a success rate in both national sport and then private tier in the NCAA, which makes him such a unicorn, honestly. And then someone like Jesse Marsch, who is such a student of the game and a student of Red Bull football and thinks this way philosophy and bridges gaps, cultures, and really wants to be a part of it. You can take someone like a Paul Stalteri, or someone of that type of experience who's like seen it abroad, played abroad, coached in this system, coached internationally, or a Mauro Biello, like someone like that. I think maybe Nick Dasovic, although that's someone personally I don't know as well, but like someone with that type of track record, especially because you have, Marsch, and let's be honest, I don't think we're expecting a Canadian to replace Bev Priestman if they change Bev Priestman. I want to see a Canadian in a power position. I think you have enough Canadians that have earned the right to do that, and you surround them with really good people like Blue and like Marsch specifically. I honestly think the sky is the limit for someone who hasn't been afforded that opportunity before.
And actually, one name that comes to mind, and then Alex, we'll let you jump in here, but he's not Canadian, but Axel Schuster has built something interesting with the Whitecaps with, a limited budget that can't necessarily compete with the big shots of MLS at this point. Could he potentially build something with Canada Soccer if he wanted a bit of a change of pace from the professional game in North America? Of course, he's not Canadian, but it does seem like that would almost fit the description that you're potentially thinking of, Brendan.
Say wrong Whitecaps now. I think you'd go Vanni Sartini.
Honestly, I'm 100% with Alex on that. 100%. I would go Vanni.
Because Vanni has that experience of coaching people, of
Coach Jesse Marsch.
of methodology, of an identity, of passing it down. I think Vanni Sartini is exactly the name you're looking for in this regard. And I mean, yeah, I've just kind of been sitting back here and listening. It's bang on all parts. I mean, at this point, we know that with the youth national teams, a shakeup is needed in the sense that, like, it's something that hinders Canada's ability to compete to their best. That they don't have, this full-fledged identity. That they don't even just have little things like experience together. But at the same time, I think there's reason for optimism, because I think Jesse Marsch is coming in on the men's side and kind of pushing that idea that, like, yeah, on the youth national team level, he wants that streamlining. He wants to be involved. The fact that this guy, his first few months on the job, he's gone to like provincial U15 championships. Like, I know there's a lot of national team coaches. Like, I'll just pull out examples. Why not? Former U.S. men's national team manager Jurgen Klinsmann. This guy, there was already beef there just because he wasn't going out to Korea to watch K-League games when he was manager of Korea, and then, that was a whole drama. Not only is Marsch going out to CPL games, MLS games, he was at the Whitecaps this past weekend. These guys out here at U15 PDP championships in Edmonton. He's on the right path, and I think that's going to obviously rub off on a lot of people around him, and they're going to want to implement similar methodology on both sides. And yeah, no, I think it's a must, because I think what's so fascinating though about this women's cycle, this U20 cycle, I still think there was a lot of reason for optimism for the players, for the group, despite it. Like, this team was quite competitive. And in 2022, they got they just weren't in any of the three games they were. It was such a, like, nondescript, 3 losses, go home. You barely got a sniff. You lost 3-1 to France, and the one goal you scored was in the 96th minute. They lost like 2-0 to South Korea. They went up first against Nigeria and lost 3-1. I will say, I mean, we can get into what I actually saw in terms of the youth tournaments, but then, yeah, you think of, man, imagine what this team could have done had they had that structure, had they had that support. And it does show how important it is to have that vision long term, because Canada at the youth level, it's fascinating. Having had the chance to kind of see some things, like there's a lot of kids right now coming up who are learning some good football methodology, who are, you know, you look at the way they play now, the things that are being prioritized, you're impressed. You're like, whoa, okay, these are things that I wish that when I was a kid growing up that I had. But then you look at some other places and you're like, oh yeah, those guys are stuck in the 80s. Those guys are kind of stuck in their old ways. And I think that's also the kind of weird part Canada soccer is that as a whole, is that there's a bit of a split of there's the modern thinking guys, the front facing guys. I think you've seen some of them in the League One, Ontario's, what they've done with some of their clubs and whatnot. And then there's still some old school thinking that it leads to guys falling through the cracks and important players falling through the cracks. And this happens on both the men's and women's sides.
What were your thoughts of the U20 women's national team?
Oh, the big one is that I thought they were very competent. I think that makes me excited because they had 2 professional players. Last tournament they had none, and just that difference of having 2 was a lot bigger than I thought it was going to be. Like just having 2 fully fledged professionals, and that excites me because the next time they'll have this tournament in 2026, Canada, hopefully if all goes right, they should be able to pick at least 10, 15, right? Because of the NSL. I'm thinking, all right, if these 2 already are making a difference, that's huge. And I think for what it's worth, like those 2 were attackers. Like if they had a professional center back on this team, they should have beat France. They scored 3 goals against France. Like it's been a while since a youth national team on the women's side has been able to do something like that. But then they just defensively, they weren't able to hold on. Then against Brazil, that Brazil game was pretty even, pretty toe-to-toe. Wasn't necessarily a 2-0 game. The second goal Brazil scored, like Canada's goalkeeper was up on a corner and they scored into an empty net. So it was really a 1-0 game. And the Spain game was really impressive. I thought Spain was going to completely blow Canada off the park. And for 45 minutes, it was pretty rough, pretty one-sided traffic. Canada went toe-to-toe with Spain in the second half and probably should have taken it to extra time. Again, they fell asleep on a defensive set piece. They didn't have that experience at the back. It's something for... in terms of the actual team itself, like lots to be encouraged about. And what's nice, it's forwards. For what it's worth, the senior team doesn't need defenders. They do need forwards. I think it's exciting that Annabelle Chukwu set the record for most youth international women's goals, a record that was previously held by Christine Sinclair. Like cap tire, she's a tri-national. You got, of course, Olivia Smith, who we've been calling for more minutes. Call her up. You got some other interesting names. Nia Rose, Jade Rose's younger sister, showed that she's a pretty good prospect. Like there's a lot of interesting attack prospects. So that's really what excited me the most, because Canada's historically really struggled to score at these youth.
To Ben's point about confidence, I watched that entire Spain game, and I feel like I should acknowledge that I thought they did look like they had it there, and I think it's a product of what the group stage was to prepare them for that. And then they play the first half, it's level, they can feel that they're going toe-to-toe, like they had that confidence and it translated. But I didn't think, to your point earlier, that that should be the expectation for this team, nor should we think that they're prepared to be that way. But they did play that way against Spain, I thought.
And also the Canadian teams went undefeated. They all won in MLS action. I think that's like rare. It's rare this year. It's rare the last couple of years that all the Canadian teams would win on the same weekend. But your thoughts on the MLS action from this weekend? Of course, the Whitecaps getting past a terrible San Jose team. I was shocked at how bad they actually were in person. And then TFC getting past Austin on a Sean Johnson magical night for him. Not so magical for TFC's backline. And then, of course, CF Montreal coming out as winners as well, even though they're pretty well out of the playoff race at this point.
Yeah, like Whitecaps looking good ahead of the final. They needed a night like San Jose where they should have won 6 or 7-0, and they just didn't. Danielle, who hates the Whitecaps, always puts his best performance, really saved the Earthquakes, made that respectable. TFC, though, very interesting times because defensively quite leaky. Sean Johnson saved them, and you look at their injury report from this week of like 3 other center backs all out injured. Heading into that Canadian Championship final, that's obviously a big thing. With the way the Whitecaps are attacking, They're not really the team you want to be sending out a B choice backline. And hey, for Montreal right now, you contrast finally a bit of optimism on the field, good performance. Their 2 American number 10s really shine, Clark and Duke, which is really good, especially Duke. It's been such a up and down season for him. But then you contrast it with, they have a protest of fans. One of the fan groups announces they're leaving. It feels like for Montreal right now, it's every 2 weeks there's some turbulence off the field, and that obviously ends up having a big impact on the entire just footballing process going on in out east.
Man, I feel for those CF Montreal fans. It's like, the revolving door of coaches. Like, just when it seems like they've got a good crop of players or something good going with the coach, mid-season it falls apart. It's really frustrating. And then you've got players like Duke who look like they could be, team MVP candidates, but then can't string that together consistently. And to Ben's point, don't have the confidence that you expect to see at that level. I thought Vancouver, they were okay. To me, it seemed like a team that knew they were more capable than their opposition, and managed their own games rather than have to worry about managing their opponent. Really, they could take it lighter and prepare for the Canadian Championship, which is the much bigger game and task ahead of them. One quick point, you guys wouldn't have heard this. I did the game with Daniil Henry on TSN, and we talked on air about this, but talked a lot off air about it, how he raves about the head of medicine at the Whitecaps, and how he spent far less time on the trainer's table because he was in that room and with the gentleman who runs the medical team, than he would have otherwise, and said that obviously we're not talking about an injury here, but when it comes to fitness, that absolutely Stuart Armstrong will be ready to go for the playoffs, and if he's at 110%, which Daniil was very confident that the medical team could get him there specifically, then he'll be banging in goals and he'll be firing for them. And I think that's kind of the thing for the Whitecaps now, is managing the season so that they still have a ton in the tank to actually play their best. And I know a couple of the listeners or Twitter commenters rip me for saying like, oh, your best players being your best players is a problem. The problem is that you need them to be elite consistently, because nobody does that. Even Tom Brady wasn't elite consistently. He lost Super Bowls. Like that's my point, and that's what the problem was. And Vancouver relies too much on those guys to always be the ones. And that's why they went out and got Ocampo, and why they got Armstrong in the first place, like exclusively to help them be better and stronger for the playoffs. So if Daniil's right and they can get Armstrong to 100%, he could be huge for them.
Are they a contender?
I mean, they could be. Alex said this a long time ago, and Alex, I don't think you really wavered. Like, I still think semifinals is the expectation for them, and I don't think that's unrealistic.
Again, I mean, we said it last week. It depends on how the draw crumbles out in terms of this weird playoff picture. But right now, I think there's not anyone in the West, even LAFC, again, it's more of a bogey thing than it is like an actually how they line up, because the Whitecaps have beaten LAFC in the last few years. It's not like LAFC's completely, taken care of them every time. It's for the Whitecaps, they can be a contender. Really, the only thing I'm looking at is like the big worry is just like when it comes to showing up in the big games, will they be able to finish their chances? Because that's really been like, again, against against Pumas, against Tigres. They went out there against those teams and they could have done better than they did, but they didn't finish. They had one goal across two legs against Tigres. Last year they only had one goal in their League's Cup game. This year against Pumas, they didn't score. That's probably my biggest worry, is just will they finish on the big stages? Because if not, they've quietly built up all the pieces you need to be a contender. They have got solid goalkeeping, very, very competent defensive line, one of the best sixes in MLS, one of the best tens in MLS, a pretty good striker in Brian White, and then a good supporting cast around him with the Ahmeds, Vites, Armstrongs now, etc. It's just a matter of when it comes to the big games, will they put it away?
And jumping into the CPL as well, from Dan Clark, with season 6 nearly over, how would you judge where the CPL is relative to expectation? Is it on, behind, or ahead of schedule, Brennan?
I think the CPL is ahead of schedule because of the pandemic that they withstood and went through. I think if it
ahead of schedule
because of that, yeah, I'm factoring that into consideration, because I think that both the pandemic should have completely derailed the CPL and the CEBL, and both seem to be successful and in a position to grow. So yeah, I think that the CPL is ahead of schedule because of that, because that had every possibility to just completely destroy the league, and it's got some issues. It's lost one team. There's attendance issues in the CPL. They're fighting for the marketplace, but the fact that they made it to year 6 and we're still talking about growth, and you're watching salaries increase, and there's still expansion interest, and the talent pool is better than ever, and no one feels like that's going to change between now and next April. Everything's on this trajectory of continued growth and a build. When I say expansion, I don't just mean other clubs, but that's a very good measurement to show how healthy things are, I think. I really think that they withstood the pandemic the best they could, and the fact that we're in this situation where we're excited to see players like Kwasi Poku and several others get these mid-season moves, because it also means that someone new is coming in the pipeline behind them. That to me shows that the league's in a really good spot. It's not like losing those players dilutes the talent pool. It just changes the talent pool, right? And we've seen it get better. To me, that's a big measurement.
Do you think the CPL has benefited from the pandemic? Like, if it weren't for the pandemic, they wouldn't be at this point?
It's difficult to say. I think soccer is in a different position now because of the pandemic. I don't necessarily think it's in a better position. So I feel like I can't totally answer that. And that's the biggest, alternate universe, right? There's so many things to it, but it's definitely possible that the pandemic, if the pandemic hadn't happened, that the league could have tanked as well. As much as I want to believe that the pandemic really harmed and held back the league, it is possible that it could have absolutely tanked through what would have been normal, healthy years if it didn't reach certain business goals, which in reality, the expectation, the pressure was lessened because you had this global disruption that really set the league back in a lot of ways, right? So, or was supposed to set the league back. So that's a difficult question, I think.
I mean, if I were to answer it, I'd say the pandemic absolutely had an effect off the field, because I think at the end of the day, like the CPL, it was always like Project 2026.
Mm-hmm.
So I think there was always that runway that it was like, do as much as you can so that by 2026 you're in a great place, so that it's after the World Cup. Maybe you can get a boon, you can get a boost, right? And then use that as a momentum. So that's why I think where the pandemic ultimately cost vital years, where you could be making in-reach, you could be doing other things, you could be getting growth in terms of expansion, in terms of everything. That's why if I were going to answer the question, I would say it's a two-part for me. I'd say it's behind schedule in terms of off the field, right? In terms of ideally, and I think no one would kid themselves with it. I think it'd be nice to have more expansion. I think Quebec is the obvious one. I think at this point you'd expect 10, 12 teams. Especially seeing how well Ottawa has stepped in and integrated with that, Atletico Madrid ownership. You thought maybe another club or two might be interested by that. And again, that's something where we have to remember that was a pre-COVID deal that ends up happening. And since then, other than Vancouver coming in, that's all we've seen in terms of expansion. So I'd say it's behind schedule in that regard. But I will say, in terms of on the field, I think it's well ahead of schedule. I think if you're thinking back 2018 and thinking 10 within the next 6 years, there's 10 CPL alumni who've played for Canada. There's a bunch who play for countries across the Caribbean. There's some who've played for countries in Europe. That's pretty cool. That there's been a bunch of sales that someone like Poku gets sold for reportedly $500,000, based off of a half season of hot form. That there's guys moving up. I'd say in that regard, it's pretty ahead of schedule, because I think it's something where you expected those first 5 to 6 years to just be guys, a lot in their mid-20s who maybe didn't get as much of a shot as they should have at certain levels, coming in, building a foundation, and then really over the next 5 years after that, then the youngsters come in, then it really takes hold. But I think it's been a surprise to see how many guys came in, got opportunities, and used them elsewhere. Think of your Sirois, your Latouris, your Watermans, your McNaughtons, and I think that's really exciting. And I think that's probably where it's ahead of schedule.
Yeah, I think one of the interesting points to me is just how quickly it transitioned from, a league that was a lot of older guys, mid-20s, early 30s, generally older guys with experience, to these young Canadians. That shift happened within 2 years. And I think the pandemic helped that shift as well, because a lot of the older guys, moved on from the game or moved on to other ventures within the game. But when you look at some of those 2019 rosters, and there were various nights that you and I would walk back to our apartment in Toronto where we'd list off like random 2019 CPLers. But I think back to, players like Hendrik Starozic, that, you don't see that type of player in the CPL anymore. And you really only saw them for that first year to kind of fill the gaps. Whereas now we're seeing young Canadians.
Nick Leisurewood, Marcus Haber. You're not going to get guys like that anymore.
Issei Nakajima Farron.
As much as I did love that Issei lived on a boat while he was playing for Pacific.
Guy was all about it. Man, I can't believe he didn't get more action in Toronto and Montreal. He's a talent, man.
I mean, the memory that stands out for me with Issei Nakajima Farron is that, what was it, that Marco Carducci played the penalty kick shootout for the Whitecaps against TFC in the Canadian Championship when he was like 17, and Nakajima Farron was playing for TFC at the time.
2014, I think it was.
Yeah,
10 years
10
ago.
years ago at this point. And there's just like so many random Canadian soccer, Canadian Premier League connections to that penalty kick shootout. I remember watching it on this little television that I had in my room at the time.
That's funny to think though. But that was early CPL, right? It was like you looked at the rosters, it was like a nostalgia trip. It was like, man, remember that guy? Remember when he was kicking it in Toronto's second team 5 years ago? And that is pretty cool to think now that there's guys where, like someone like Grady McDonald, who was, I'm happy I mentioned him actually, because him and Shola Jima were two names I forgot to mention to one of the questions earlier about youngsters to watch. Those are two to watch. That like both of them, Jima chose York over being in TFC system at 16. Grady McDonald had the choice of, do I want to stick in the Whitecap system or go pro at VFC at 16? That now it's like a legitimate option for guys as well to for their careers, and again, that's super exciting as well.
And the next question from Marsh and Blue 2024 at Toronto Maple FC2. Will I be making the trip to beautiful Oshawa for the U Sports Men's Soccer Championships, which I don't think looks like the photo that you submitted. I have been to Oshawa, to an Oshawa Generals game when I was working for the Kingston Frontenacs a lifetime ago, it seems. But I'll be there for some games. I don't think I'm going to, completely go to all of the games like I would have a couple of years ago, or even last year when I went to Kingston for all of the U Sports Women's Soccer Championship. But there's a good chance you'll see me on the final day for the third place game and the final. I would.
We're sending you there for NFP. We need you as our resident draft expert for.
Yeah, so you can make a U Sports team that can play against Fonzie and David and Tejan in some fantasy camp of yours. Yeah, how else would we get that answer?
Come on, it's your assignment for the fall.
Oh yeah, I have to source out the CPL draft picks based on not necessarily the best players in U Sports, but more so there's some tinkering that seems to go on with the CPL draft that I always find a little bit.
Who is Laurier's defensive midfielder, and why should he be in Jesse Marsch's team? Go. No, don't go. That's how you lose me. I'm out, bro. See you.
Hey, Nico Sigor was the York midfielder. Thomas Neff called his last goal in U Sports actually.
Say 113th minute or whatever it was.
Yeah, against
Northern
Ryerson.
Football OG.
Or I guess at that point they were the Rams. Yeah. But yeah, Brendan, you got to hop. We got just a couple more minutes and a couple more questions here in this show.
I'm out, boys.
Yeah, certainly
Fun stuff.
Fun question, and you'll probably see me in Oshawa, and as Brendan just
hiking one of these beautiful mountains that he sent.
And I guess just the last thing we've got on hand is the Canadians Abroad section, and just a few things that stand out that Alex jotted down. Another Canadian center back has gotten a red card in Liga, and Derek Cornelius was sent off for a time-wasting second yellow in Marseille's win over France. And that's just a weird card to get. It's very MLS, might I say. Yes, and the winner was over Nice, not the French national team, but... yeah, a bit of a weird game, bit of a weird Liga, man. It's very I gotta love though that for example Marseille, in the most Liga fashion, they just started throwing the what we say the fumigène onto the field, all the flares, all the smokes. I couldn't tell if that was just in protest to the referee or just for vibes. So quite the game, but yeah, the second yellow is just hilarious because Cornelius is over the ball, guy kind of steps in to block him a bit. Cornelius is fine, get out of my way. Waits, about to go, and then the ref just blows and gives it. And it was
where's the warning? And it was like the 67th minute. Like, you can very much just like, hey, no more of this, cut it out. And it was just so like no, straight up, screw it, get a second yellow. So I'm very fascinated to see how, because Marseille appealed it, of course. Like, duh. Like, does this appeal go through? Like, is this something where it's just like, ref was obviously frustrated? It was, Marseille home game. Fans are quite loud. Nice, a good team. It was a good matchup, chippy game where you just kind of wanted to keep things from bubbling over. I just feel like they actually do have a legitimate chance with that. And I guess all I'd say to the two Canadian center backs, like, welcome to Liga. What a time it can be in terms of the crowds, the refereeing, everything like that. It can be a very vastly different experience from game to game, and it's kind of just funny that. And the ironic part I will just say is, like, Bombito got sent off having an immaculate game, like 10 out of 10 game, right? This one, Cornelius, he was excellent. Best game by 5 for Marseille. Looks so confident. He's looking good, gets sent off. So maybe there's something where the Canadian center backs are just not allowed to have good performances. So maybe we'll see them level it out with 7 out of 10s. Or I don't know. I just hope the next Bombito will be back. Like, give us a 10 out of 10 and hopefully don't get sent off, and we'll have a good day about it.
Ishmael Kone also made his debut in that match. How did he fare?
Yeah, he was pretty well. A bit unlucky that he was on the field for about 2 minutes, and then the red card happened. So he spent most of the time without his Canadian compatriot down a man. But what I liked is that his work rate was great, and I think that's the little things that Jesse Marsch going to love. Roberto De Zerbi, there was one moment, I think it was the 90th minute, still like a 2-0 game. I think at that point, Kone made this bursting run to go press a guy, won the ball back, created a chance. His teammate should have scored. And it was like, okay, that's good. That's what Kone we want to see, because we know Kone can dribble at this level, play at this level, pass. Like, you saw it right away. He's class. He was class in preseason. But it's going to be those little things like work rate, like effort, especially because Marseille is loaded in midfield, and now they've just added Adrien Rabiot, which is another guy for Kone to compete against. How's he going to have to stand out against those guys? It's not just his class, but also show that, yeah, I can play in the pivot. I can play a little deeper. I can help you press. So I was encouraged to see little things like the work rate on top of his usual class. And
on the women's side of things, Janine Becky scored for Louisville and Chloe Lacasse scored for the Utah Royals as both opened their accounts with their new NWSL clubs. Could these moves be what the pair needs to stay in the CanWNT picture long term? And I do wonder whether Becky's going to be long term for Louisville, because it does seem like they've signed a bunch of these contracts to go for it this season. In what seemed like a very weird year in the NWSL, because like the Seattle Reigns loaned out Sophie Huerta to France this week, which makes no sense to me. Like there's just a lot of odd moves, and Louisville has been at the forefront of some of those odd moves that are really focusing on this year.
Yeah, but it's weird because it feels like such a 3-horse race, because usually the NWSL is like wide open, and it feels like right now there's like 3 dominant teams. Like the Spirit have been excellent. Shout out to Gabby Carl, had a good game this weekend. There's the Orlando Pride, who've been phenomenal, led by Barbara Banda, and of course there's been the KC Current, who've been excellent. It feels like those are like the big 3. Like, no one's been close to them this year, and it feels like the last few years, like there's that season where San Diego was really dominant, but they weren't that dominant. Like, they were still within the touching distance. So it is a bit of a tough time for these teams like Louisville's or Portland, who had such that hot run and then have kind of fallen off a bit lately. But in terms of those two Canadians, I am curious to see if we see more moves like that, because like Becky was stuck at a congested Thorns team where she was in and out just because they have so much forward depth. I do wonder if these moves, while maybe they're not the most appealing at first glance to see, Lacasse leave Arsenal. It sucks because it felt like she was a bit of a cult hero there and was good enough at that level. Ditto with Becky at the Thorns. But I think it is exciting to see that at these two clubs, they're going to be stars. They're going to be focal points. And now that they've got the goals, like both great goals. Becky megs the defender, scores a powerful shot. Lacasse gets one from distance. I think on that side, I wonder if for these players when they're 30s, they're not young. They're not in positions where, at least you're at a Thorns, at least you're at an Arsenal, you're developing. No, they're at an opportunity where you know what Becky is. You know what Lacasse is. They need to play. They need to get minutes. So I'm kind of like, okay, maybe these moves are kind of the way to go for some of these older players. I wonder, for example, if an Adriana Leon, if at any point she loses a Villa spot, might it be best to go to an NWSL team that needs a forward and just be a star? And there's a few others kind of in that position in their 30s that will be looking to keep their spots long term with Chuck Woos, with Olivia Smiths, with all these players kind of now starting to knock on the door.
That's really all we've got for this pod, but it does also sound like we might be nearing, in the next couple weeks, even potentially within 10 days, some signings in the NSL, which I've heard some rumblings that I'm not going to uncover on the podcast here, but you might hear some things if you stay tuned to my social media and Canadian Soccer Daily as well. There's the Brendan shout, even though he had to leave the podcast a little bit early.
So there's tea coming, right? That's what you're saying.
There's tea coming in the NSL,
but good tea.
But that's all we've got for episode 194 of the Northern Football Podcast. Brendan from Ottawa, Alex from right beside me here in the Nation Network studios at the Wall Center in Vancouver. Thanks so much for tuning in. Make sure to subscribe, rate, review the podcast wherever you get it, and you can also watch the podcast and at least Alex's beautiful face. I don't know about mine, but
don't get yourself dirty there.
And Brendan's, of course, on his new camera. And you can watch that on the 90th Minute YouTube channel. And also a shout out to our producer Brett Holden, who's been fantastic in getting these shows up, quickly, and they're looking good too. So thanks, Brett, and thanks for tuning into the show as well.